I have a question for you, Fuzz. The the conversation about bringing dignity and humanity and God kind of putting parameters on that. I am still torn between the meme that is said tongue in cheek of God he did say no shellfish, easy peasy. Whether or not people obeyed it or not, you know where God stands on shellfish. But he didn't say no slavery, and I think that there's a parsing of words here of, well, it's more of an employee or whatever. And I'm even seeing that in the chat that a lot of people are chiming in that it's more of an indentured servant. But again, I have the sticking point where Josh even brought it up of I can't beat my hired servant to the point of almost death and then say, well, as long as he lives, or she, there, I mean, there's a more emotionally charged thing. I could beat the woman almost to death, but as long as she lives for a day or two, then we good. So how is this?
I mean, in my opinion, this is where the idea of causative law comes in. And of course, we need to read these passages now in the context of Proverbs, where there's, in a couple of places it talks about the use of the rod as a way to instruct, to provide discipline and correction to children. And that's also used to provide instruction and discipline and correction to those people that are in your service, right? And to me, the idea here is that you've got a patriarchal society where there's a head of a household, and that head of the household has, if you will, parental responsibilities to the entire household. And part of that is to ensure that providing instruction, providing discipline and correction. And so I hardly think that and a rod, by the way, was not a weapon. It was essentially an implement of discipline.
But it still caused bodily harm. I mean, if those were the rules nowadays, those people would be in jail.
No, but the idea was that you were supposed to strike people in areas that were non-vulnerable. Right?
Look, I don't want to be struck anywhere. To me, assault and battery is still assault and battery.
Well, I'd have a hard time arguing that a parent spanking a child is actually immoral, right? Or is
well, I mean, okay. But, I mean, granted, I think spanking is going to be a little bit different.
Well,
degree,
but
when you beat somebody to the inch of their life, that to me would be
right.
morally
But wait a minute,
egregious,
Steve. Wait a minute, Steve. I understand your point, but this is where the causative law becomes really important, or this concept.
Casuistic. Is casuistic.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you. No, sure. Appreciate it. Biochemist here, not a
no. Hey, I hear you.
Not a biblical scholar.
Don't ask me anything scientific.
But in a sense, it's again case law, where the idea here is that it is okay to administer correction to your servant, but if you beat them, if you go to the extreme that you are either killing them, your life is going to be required of you. That right away says that this debt servant is not property, but is actually equivalent to you, is a human being that is equivalent to you. Or if you injure them, if you strike them in the eye, or they lose an eye or lose a tooth, that means you're hitting them in the head. That's a vulnerable area that they are immediately granted release from the contract. And if they're injured, then, and they're able to get up and recover from that, well, then the idea here is that because they are your means of earning income, you are punished, or your retribution, or is that you lost that person's labor for that period of time. So I don't see this as being, saying that it's okay to beat your servant. It's essentially saying, if this happens, in other words, that passage is actually putting restrictions on what the Lord or the master can do in the household.
But how does that follow? That's not property. I mean, look.
Yeah, the Bible verse actually says, the Bible verse says the qualifier is because they are your property.
No, it's because they are your silver.
Well,
property
is a fine translation.
So let's say that nowadays,
it is
nowadays animal.
Well,
animals,
the Hebrew word there,
it's kesef. Yes, I know what the Hebrew word is, and
it's silver.
Its property is absolutely fine.
All right. Well, let me make this throw this out there. Nowadays, when you have an animal is considered to be personal property. Okay. Doesn't mean you can beat them. It still means that you have to treat them humanely. There's still laws in effect that came from man to say, hey, you know what? If you have an animal, you have a stewardship of it. You're not allowed to beat them in any degree, right? But 2,000 years ago, it seemed to be that to be the case. You're allowed to beat somebody to an inch of their life, whether they're property or not. Nowadays, animals are property, yet we treat them more humane than what it seems like the biblical times did to their slaves.
Would it be okay if I just want to say something that I think is germane to this? So it's interesting and probably not terribly well known. It wasn't to me anyway. That the laws in the antebellum South are actually quite similar to Exodus 21. So, which is very surprising to people, right? We always hear this. Well, they're much better in the antebellum South. It's not. Actually, the laws are pretty close in this regard. So if particularly following the revolution, and if people want to read about this, Tom Morris has a book out. I can get anyway. But if a slave died in the antebellum South in circumstances other than mild correction, it was like murdering a white person. Right, that's what they considered it, murder, and they considered that the penalty, in particular in Virginia, but you couldn't just go murder a slave if you beat them. And they said, well, if it's moderate correction was what the law said, then there wouldn't be punishment. But if it was more than moderate correction, and the problem is that nobody would make the argument today that that's okay. Right, and if you look at what loopholes that created, it wasn't the point of the law. Right. If you read what some of these justices say, they say like no good Christian would do these types of egregious things, to beat them, outright. That wasn't the point of the law. And I think Fuzz is absolutely right here. Right. The point of the text is not to say, all right, here's the way you can beat them and get away with it. The point of the law is to say, look, Proverbs 29:19-21 makes it very clear that slaves are not motivated by words alone, right? So it's absolutely recommended that you discipline a slave with a wooden rod, but be careful how you do it. That's the point of the law. And if you beat them if you beat them as Dr. Rana said, probably about the head, and they died immediately under the hand, well then probably death penalty. That's probably what nakam means there. And if you hit them in the face, knock out a tooth, knock out an eye, what it is it's evidence that you're not disciplining them. It's evidence that there's malice behind it. That's probably the way to take that. So I agree. This is a protection, actually. The problem is that we wouldn't beat our kids with a wooden rod. I wouldn't. And so I think we've evolved past that.